Perhaps the only advantage of building in what we call gated communities, which is becoming the norm these days, is that the architect gets a tabula rasa to really experiment. I don't think it's an ideal sort of a format for a city, but I think it gives you that opportunity to really experiment with the private house, and I think that's what this project gave us. The project really began with Usha telling us that she was an architect, and being a writer, she would retreat into a writer's mind. So we were really looking at, okay, well, how could we express a building that mapped the journey of how a writer thought? There was something that was fascinating to her, which was the whole contrast of dark spaces and spaces that had light, and the very, very subtle thresholds between these two. So we ended up looking at this project almost like a subterranean subterfuge. Could we look at this typology as one which had multiple verandas which strung onto a very dark space, which is light-seeking? So just the idea of a dark space that begins to create a spinal corridor. Onto it, you have things which attach. So you have something which does that. You have something which does this. It has its own life, because in one case, it overlooks an old fig tree and you want to capture the views of the fig tree. On the other case, you want to have it twist and turn because you want a little bit more light from one particular direction. And it just attaches onto this loosely, creating perforations in the middle. If I were to just map an imaginary boundary at the edge of this paper, you'd see then that the house does not address as important the arbitrary site boundary, but rather it begins to put together an experience which has to do with light, which has to do with creating an entity in the landscape around it and engaging with that in a more intimate way.
So this becomes actually the structural spine of the house. And if you look at the joints, so the horizontal lines are just the stages of construction. So it was done one after the other after the other. And then as you rise up, you start seeing facets in the roof. Those are slopes which are created for the water to go and be collected. The ridges and the valleys are demarcated by the shift of planes with grooves.
First things that Usha brought to our studio was a book of Tadao Ando's work, because she absolutely loved concrete, and I think all of us as architects, we can relate to that. I think as we went deeper into the project, we felt that it was a perfect fit, because what happens is the spine that we talked about, the spinal connector, is best when it's a molded space.
It feels almost like a cave which one is entering. So the transformation from the day to the night is like two different people at two different times of life. So when you come through this cavernous kind of entrance with this high volume and light which is sort of coming through the skylight and grazing the concrete, the only element that you see in the middle of the space, which is part of the living room, is the bar where I'm actually standing. So this is made in concrete, and the bar is inside with a refrigerator, with bottles, glasses and everything. So it's a lovely little platform with a lovely bench which is detailed. It has a slight slope which pushes you towards the counter. So I think that's something which is quite wonderful, because it gives a kind of intimacy and a kind of a gesture which is of congregation around this bar. The bar is lit by this very, very slim set of stainless steel lights. It's called the sextuplets, which won the Elle Decor Light of the Year Design Award. Made with just slim sections of bent stainless steel, which have just a tiny light, and it creates a kind of a reflection which is around just on these strips of metal delicately hanging in this space, which are set against the concrete. So the core of the house is somehow driven by this idea of being surrounded by absolute grey neutrality of space, where it seems rather ephemeral.
So if we were to just stand in front of this wall and just watch it through the day, the whole palette, the whole artwork changes. When you're really dealing with light, you don't need any ornament. And the wall begins to tell a story. You see the grind marks, you see the pits, you see the surface, which almost at certain angles looks like fabric because it bulges, it almost has a slight billowy bulge. There are little undulations which talk about the material, and every time light moves across, it's a different experience.
So in this very minimal space, if you look at the floor, you'll see that the skirting is actually recessed. It is lined with zinc. I think the beauty of that is that the wall goes right till the level of the floor and lower, so that it's very easy to clean, and it's quite a beautiful separation of the structure and the floor. You see some of the art collection which is here, which is Somnath Hor, which is Ganesh Alloy. Behind me is also KG Subramaniam's drawings. It's a great honor to have a drawing of the house along with this wonderful artwork, which shows how the central portion of the spine, which is this almost like a cave-like entrance, which sort of mediates through the house, and all the other spaces are attached to it. A transformation of that is the light that you see hanging here above, which is actually like a bonsai. It is a miniaturization of the space and an inverted. So the facets of the roof are actually the bottom of the light, and that's exactly the concrete spine, and also has a kind of reference to with the perforated sheet, a raw mild steel rusted sheet, to using of scrap which was generated after making the staircase, and how we could actually reuse this with this kind of light which would filter through and has a scale large enough to be over the dining table and light up with a dimmable light which can create an ambience around it.
So the spine as an experience is at one level a corridor, but it's also a connector, and it was important therefore that the staircase which positions itself here is as light an imprint as possible, as delicately poised within the space, so that the whole beauty of the space is highlighted rather than taken away.
It has a good amount of possibility of being invisible in extreme light when it comes through the skylight. So in this way, it's like a folded sheet which has been wrapped on this structure, while the structure is very, very linear for the stranger.
That's really an important aspect, where you have something which actually is so light that it gets absent. This whole idea of absence and presence visually manifest by just the lightness of the material and the transparency of it. The rooms, if you were to call them veranda attachments, are quite monastic, just allowing the textures of the material to enliven the space and create richness, which is again very, very subtle. The detail has really been thought about, especially the master bedroom, which also becomes Usha's writing space, where the idea of being monastic has been an intention, with the warmth of wood coming in just right there. Everywhere else it's grey, it's a very monochromatic background, but right there you have, just at the space where one is working in the garden with a window adjoining the garden, though rich and warm, is also monastic.
The window has some quite unique details. a frameless opening like this, which shows only the jambs of the windows and doesn't show the frame at all, which helps me hide the frame completely and gives a clean opening to the whole thing. There are these strange looking flaps on next to the window. The idea was, of course, it has a screen which is like a Venetian blind, which can be dropped down, but also when you want to cut off the light completely in the bedroom, so there is a detail which is a very light shutter. So it remains white just like the walls, and if it's a very long opening, which is like what we have on this side, and you want to see part of the window, then you shut a certain part above and you shut the lower part after that. Very simple details with a designed stainless steel pivoted fixture. A window is a window. How can we transform that? So how does the window frame slide so that it leaves an absolutely seamless opening? So I think the beauty of that is it gives you the depth of the material. So the roof of the house actually is absolutely undulating, and one of the ideas which we wanted to collect all the rainwater which comes onto the roof, that it could be collected into this stainless steel trough which has been inserted into the lawn, and it has a sieving mechanism with simple stones and a kind of a sieve mesh inside. All this water is collected and then taken into a tank which is used for the irrigation of the landscape, the trees, and this beautiful gargoyle which is like a spout which has been formed, which narrows itself, pours itself into the collection area of this ellipse, and you find that this is clad with zinc, which has been beautifully done by Jean-Marc. Where the folds take place, there are no screws in this. It becomes a piece that you see from outside the house. It becomes a defining element, and it also becomes the view from inside the study within the house. There are a couple of things which I want to show here. One is the little device for the bell, which is on top of this little pedestal which has been made. So it has a light integrated into it, made of zinc, and the door is a full height door which has a kind of a pun of enter at your own risk, because it has this guillotine kind of shape, and on the upper part there is a portion where with a mesh it can actually be opened so that it can allow for ventilation at the upper level. All the other doors are large and just with glazing, but this door seems to be this metaphorical protector of the house.
The spinal corridor having very precise cuts in an otherwise very dark amorphous space, and the verandas which kind of attach onto this large sort of linear journey-like spatial element begin to have a quality of light which is mellowed, and this was the difference that needed to be a part of the scheme as we contrasted living spaces from the connector.
How does such a dissonant kind of plan appear to be so easy to live with? So I think this has been quite an experience of having made and realized that it is not just the playfulness of the plan, because that was immaterial in the thought process. It was completely about occupying and anchoring itself in the land in the most interesting ways, so that the gardens is not just one singular garden, it's actually multiple gardens with very, very different views. I think it's great to wonder about what happens when we don't look at architecture from a formal perspective, but from the experience of what it can create and the essence of living within them as something which can grow on you.